Hello and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Giacomucci, and I'm here to present my conference presentation titled Morenian History, Philosophy, and Sociatry, Journeying to Psychodrama's Philosophical Home. I'm really excited and I feel really honored for the invitation to present at the first International Scientific and Practical Conference of Psychodrama, the Path Home in Ukraine. So if I don't get the chance to thank you in person, please receive my gratitude over the internet here for offering me the invitation to present here. So a little bit about myself and my background. I have a doctorate in clinical social work. I'm a trauma expert, psychodramatist, and an educator and author. I run the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy, which is outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I also am the Director of Trauma Services at Miramont Treatment Center, which is an inpatient addictions treatment center. I'm an adjunct professor at Bryn Mawr College's Graduate School of Social Work, and I was one of 3 co-editors on Jacob Moreno's Autobiography of a Genius, which was published earlier this year. So here's a picture of the cover of Moreno's Autobiography of a Genius. The title might sound strange, but in declaring himself a genius, Moreno is also declaring that you're a genius, and that all human beings are potentially a genius. He calls upon all humans to recognize their creative genius and co-create a better world, a better society, a better community, and better groups. This is a quote from the Moreno's work. He says that instead of looking at mankind as a fallen being, everybody is a potential genius, and like the supreme being, co-responsible for all of mankind. It's the genius we should emphasize, not the failing. If you're really interested in learning about Moreno's history and the history of his methods, the autobiography is a good read. It really introduces you to him as a person with all of his genius and all of his flaws. He really censored nothing in his writing. And it gives a good history of his methods and outlines the thinking of his, in terms of his philosophy, especially his mystical philosophy. So here's kind of a brief history of Moreno. What he describes as his mystical phase was earlier in his life. A lot of people don't realize that prior to founding Psychodrama, he was a mystic. He founded a religion called the Religion of the Encounter. And it was based on the idea that within each person existed God, and that we should treat everybody as if they were God, as if they were divine. He had a vision of what he called sociatry, psychiatry for society. That rather than looking at how do we heal individuals or help individuals heal themselves in individual sessions, that we need to focus on all of society. In the early 1920s, Moreno entered his theater phase, where he founded the Theater of Spontaneity, which was based on spontaneously enacting scenes from the community or from the newspaper or proposed stories from audience members. Instead of having a script, the actors who got on stage just spontaneously enacted scenes. It was through his work with the Theater of Spontaneity in Vienna and later Impromptu Theater in New York City that he really started to see not just the catharsis that audience members experienced, but also the catharsis that actors themselves were experiencing through playing roles. And here he started to experiment with assigning roles to his different actors based on their personal or emotional issues that he knew of. Here we can see some of the underpinnings, the early groundwork for psychodrama, which came much later. Moreno then in the 30s entered what he calls his sociometric phase. In the early 30s, he published his famous book, Who Shall Survive?, which outlined his sociometric research in New York State. He worked at a girls' reform school in the community and did a ton of sociometric research, looking at the distribution of choices and connections within several dozen, a few hundred girls who were in this reform school. In the 30s, he also founded the first sociometry journals and began teaching his methods at different universities in New York. In the early 40s, I should also say that in 1932, Moreno first used the term group psychotherapy and group therapy. He was the first to use those terms. Later in the early 1940s, Moreno established the American Society of Group Psychotherapy and Psychodrama. It was in the late 30s, early 40s that he really started to use psychodrama as a therapeutic approach at the hospital that he ran in New York, St. Elizabeth's Hospital outside Washington, D.C. in the United States here. Built a psychodrama stage, and the United States government, especially the Veterans Administrations, really started to adopt and integrate psychodrama into its programs. And in the 40s, Moreno published Psychodrama Volume 1, his first textbook on psychodrama. The 50s and 60s were really characterized by international teaching. Moreno was traveling all around the world, all around the United States, teaching and promoting his methods. Jacob Moreno then died in 1974, and Zerka really had been working with him for decades prior to that. But when J.L. Moreno died, Zerka really carried on his work, added to it, translated it, made it more understandable. Many people refer to her as the mother of psychodrama, and that she continued teaching and training and nurturing the next generation of psychodramatists around the world. So in psychodrama's role theory, we say that the personality, or the self, is composed of all the roles that one holds in their life. So I thought it would be an interesting way of doing a PowerPoint presentation to present Moreno from the perspective of different roles that were prominent in his biography. So the first role is Moreno the mystic. Moreno's methods all emerged from his spiritual and mystical philosophy. If you read his autobiography, he says that the first sociometric system he envisioned was that of the Godhead, and that his psychodrama as God was really the underpinnings of his later psychodrama work. That he believed one could not fully understand his therapeutic approaches, his group work approach, without first understanding his spiritual philosophy. He attempted to create a revolution in the way that we experience God, suggesting that God exists within each individual, that instead of thinking of God as out there, out in the universe, that God existed within each person. One of his quotes, I believe these are actually quotes from Zerka, she says that our instruments are basically spiritual and existential, pointing to and supporting the value of the human spirit. We are more than biological, economical, and sociological or psychological creatures, and that first of all, we are cosmic beings. So one of the core spiritual teachings in Moreno's work is that of the Autonomous Healing Center. Zerka, most of the writing on the Autonomous Healing Center comes from Zerka Moreno. She really believed, as did Jacob Moreno, that the purpose of psychodrama and all forms of group therapy was to help the client or help the group remove barriers to tapping into their autonomous healing center, their ability to heal themselves. In social work with groups, we call this mutual aid. The idea that groups have the fundamental capacity to heal themselves, that each member in the group can contribute to the healing of other members of the group. There's a couple quotes here, also from Zerka, about the Autonomous Healing Center. She says that Moreno attributed healing to what is going on silently, mostly invisibly, in the body and deep inside the self, not touched by words, but through action, often continuing well after treatment. He termed it due to the Autonomous Healing Center within. Awakening the Autonomous Healing Center, the power to heal oneself, is how I see the value of psychodrama in all forms of therapy. Zerka says that my task is to find and touch the Autonomous Healing Center within, to assist and direct the protagonist to do the same. That we are merely guides in the wilderness, clearing away obstacles so protagonists can find their own path. So, Moreno as the sociatrist. Of course, he studied psychiatry at the University of Vienna, which is when he developed his vision of sociatry, psychiatry for society. He believed that working with individuals was not enough and that social problems needed to be addressed in groups and within society and within the culture. One of his famous quotes is that a truly therapeutic procedure cannot have less an objective than the whole of mankind. But no adequate therapy can be prescribed as long as mankind is not a unity in some fashion, and as long as its organization remains unknown. So here he's talking about expanding the vision for therapy to all of society. And then in order to intervene appropriately, we first need to understand the formation and evolution and dynamics within groups and within society. He says that a system of society must be realized in which all individuals belong as initiators without exception. Not 99.9%, but literally all individuals alive. That all individuals are co-responsible for mankind. Zerka later says that sociatry is social immunization. It's meant to prevent outbreaks of violence in the larger world and to bring an awakening of the organic unity of mankind. We'll talk more about that in a future slide here. Later, Moreno really took the role of a theater director. As I had mentioned previously, he was deeply influenced by the theater and Aristotle's writings on catharsis. As I mentioned earlier, his theater had no script and was based purely on spontaneity. He really intended to start a creative revolution through the theater. He wanted to reach large audiences of people. He wanted to reach much more people than he possibly could have by working with individual clients. He believed in the theater's potential to provide catharsis and healing for larger numbers. As a social worker and really a historian of Moreno's work, I started to think of Moreno as a social group worker. In many ways, he was a social worker. He never called himself that, but he was working with oppressed and underserved communities throughout his entire career, including working with children, working with immigrants and refugees. He worked in refugee camps. He worked with prostituted women in Vienna, which is where he started to see the therapeutic agency and power of each individual in the group. When he moved to New York, he worked with inmates in Sing Sing prison and at-risk youth, girls in a reform school in New York. And then he later worked with patients who had some really severe psychiatric conditions. So he was constantly working with oppressed and marginalized communities. Moreno was one of the first to suggest that mental illness was a result of interpersonal relations and social forces. That mental illness wasn't something that just existed within the individual psyche, but that it was a product of society. And this idea really mirrors the philosophy and social work of looking at the individual within their social environment, person and environment perspective. Again, Moreno's group work approach is based on mutual aid. He says that each individual in the group has therapeutic agency and power. Each individual has the ability to help each other in the group, to educate each other in the group. That the healing in a psychodrama doesn't come from the director to the protagonist, but between the protagonist and the roles and the auxiliaries playing the roles. This idea of mutual aid is a core and essential part of social work with groups. So Moreno's triadic system is sociometry, psychodrama, and group psychotherapy. And he was the first to coin the terms. He defines sociometry as the inquiry into the evolution and organization of groups and the position of individuals within those groups. And psychodrama as an experiential form of therapy where issues are externalized through role-playing techniques. Psychodrama literally means psyche in action. It's important to note that psychodrama is not only a therapy, but that it's also used, and Moreno really emphasized that it's used outside of therapeutic settings as well. In education, in training, in religious communities, in society. So Moreno, the sociometrist. Moreno believed that problems of groups needed to be treated within groups. And that just like we begin individual therapy with assessment, that group therapy had to begin with assessment. How could we intervene on the issues with groups if we don't first assess the group? He says that group psychotherapy had to start with assessment. In his sociometry research, Moreno discovered a lot of significant ideas and phenomenons, some of which are the organic unity of mankind, the psychodrama and sociometric concept of tele, and the sociodynamic effects, as well as the social atom, the social network, and many other ideas. Moreno created many terms to describe different social phenomenon that he was writing about and describing that many others hadn't labeled before. Moreno often used to say that he used psychodrama to get people into the room so that he could teach them sociometry. So he really believed that sociometry was at least equally as important as psychodrama. And here's some core sociometry philosophy defined. First, I want to bring your attention to the images on the right side of the screen here. The top image is a sociogram. This is actually a sociogram from one of my classes, where I asked the students to list their top 3 preferences for students in their class that they would like to co-facilitate a group with. The sociogram shows the depiction of choices within that group. And you can see that there's a social star, number 14, as well as isolates within the group, others in the group that didn't receive as many choices. This phenomenon of the unequal distribution of choices or social wealth is what Moreno called the sociodynamic effect. He said it's underlying all social problems in society. On the other hand, we can also see that there's numerous mutual choices within the sociogram. This is because of tele, Moreno said. That tele is the socio-gravitational force that brings human beings together more often than upon chance. That if we were to ask a computer to predict with 14 people in the group, how many times are people going to choose each other? What's the probability of that? The actual number of mutual choices is much higher than we would expect based on chance. Moreno talked about the organic unity of mankind basically as this shared humanness that binds us all together as a single group, a single entity. That just like we approach the group as a whole, the group as the patient, as its own entity, that society that mankind was its own group, its own entity, that it had its own organic unity, just like a smaller group has. He sometimes refers to this as our primordial nature. Then we have Moreno's social atom, which is a map of close relationships around an individual. And an interesting sociometry philosophy of Moreno's, if you look at the image on the bottom right, Moreno actually argued that the psyche existed outside of the body, and that the reason why we're able to interface with each other on the social level and experience tele and transference and projection and with each other is that because our psyches are constantly interfacing with each other, but that the body exists within the psyche. Of course, this idea challenges the medical model, because if mental illness exists within the psyche, in Moreno's idea, it's not within the body, but that it's in between the body and the social, and that it had to be treated in groups, had to be treated at the societal level and through relationships. Here's Moreno as the psychodramatist. So although the first psychodrama is considered to have taken place on April 1st, 1921, which technically was a sociodrama, psychodrama as a treatment approach did not develop until 1936, when Moreno opened a hospital in New York. Many people think that psychodrama is just an intervention, but it's really its own philosophical system. Moreno was really upset that people took his interventions and didn't integrate his philosophy into their work. So psychodrama has its own theory of personality, which is role theory, its own theory of change, spontaneity, creativity theory, action theory, its own theory of human nature, its own theory of relationships and encounter, its own theory of child development, its own theory of society, its own interventions. It really is its own comprehensive system that can exist on its own, and parts of it can be integrated into other systems, such as cognitive behavioral therapy or Jungian psychology or psychoanalysis. So it can be integrated into other systems, and it's important to recognize that it can stand on its own. Here's some of the core psychodrama philosophy. Action theory. Moreno believed that because we were wounded in action, we must also be healed in action. Spontaneity, creativity theory. Moreno argued that spontaneity is what creates change for humans, and that spontaneity is the ability to adequately respond to new situations and to respond in new ways to old situations. So in a lot of ways, spontaneity is about competence. Role theory describes the idea that the self expresses itself through roles, and that all of the roles that we hold in our life make up our personality. There's different levels of role development. That starts with role taking, and then role playing, and then role creating. There's a lot that goes into role theory. And then Moreno's developmental theory has 3 phases of child development, which reflect the interventions we use in psychodrama: doubling, mirroring, and role reversal. So to end with a quote from Moreno himself about his philosophical system, Moreno says, "I've had the good fortune to develop 3 ideas. The first idea, a study of the Godhead, which has remained cryptic and misapprehended. The second idea, a study of man called psychodrama, which has aroused some hope that man can train his spontaneity to overcome many of his shortcomings. My third idea, the study of society called sociometry, has given the greatest promise that a measure can be developed for a deeper understanding of society and a key to the treatment of its ills. Many of my friends consider these 3 ideas one apart from the other, In my own mind, however, all the three ideas are of one piece. One is developed out of the other. The first idea, the Godhead, initiates a canon of the entire universe. The second, a canon of the individual. And the third, a canon of human society. If you're interested in learning more, here's some resources that you might consider looking into. We have the International Association of Group Psychotherapy, which has a very active psychodrama section with conferences all over the world, including upcoming conferences in Egypt and Canada. The oldest group psychotherapy organization in the world is actually the American Society of Group Psychotherapy and Psychodrama. Our next conference is in Chicago on the weekend of April Fool's Day, April 1st, 2020. I invite you to come join us. Our 100th anniversary psychodrama conference of the ASGPP will be held outside of New York City in Newark, New Jersey in 2021. My website here for the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy. Feel free to read up a little bit more about my work. My email is on the bottom of the slide here. I would invite you to reach out to me. I would love to talk more. I would love to send you more resources if you're interested. If you're interested in the autobiography of a genius, you can order it through Amazon.com or Lulu.com. So that concludes my presentation here. And I know I'm just about out of time. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to teach a little bit about what I've learned. Again, I'm very honored to be a part of the conference. I wish you well going forward with the rest of the conference, and thank you again.